Keynes' collection, Macroeconomics, Neoclassical Economic Theory, Business Cycles, and Government Intervention, the first works by Keynes entered the public domain in 2016, yet we continue to inhabit an era defined by modern monetary policy and governmental intervention. Macroeconomics, as a discipline, was fundamentally reinvented by Keynes, who emphatically endorsed the government's role amid a backdrop of imperialism and the rise of multinational corporations. This conceptual shift would eventually devolve into formal collaborations and alliances of corporate power and international interests. Consequently, the ruling establishment has incorporated agents of foreign lobbies and board members from various concerns. On the other side of the spectrum, grassroots opposition, often composed of self-identified libertarians, advocates for the disengagement from special interests. However, they often overlook the intricate, chimera-like relationship that the awakened behemoth of corporate power shares with the leviathan of government, a symbiosis aimed at averting larger-scale conflicts. Historically, the disarmament of foreign rulers and marcher states has never occurred without bloodshed. Let us momentarily revisit the libertarian utopia, a world before the advent of Keynesian economics. In this context, please give audience to my compendium of Keynesian macroeconomic theories, critiques, and policy advisories. Europe before the war, before 1870, different parts of the small continent of Europe had specialized in their own products, but, taken as a whole, it was substantially self-subsistent. And its population was adjusted to this state of affairs. After 1870, there was developed on a large scale an unprecedented situation, and the economic condition of Europe became during the next 50 years unstable and peculiar. The pressure of population on food, which had already been balanced by the accessibility of supplies from America, became for the first time in recorded history definitely reversed. As numbers increased, food was actually easier to secure. Larger proportional returns from an increasing scale of production became true of agriculture as well as industry. With the growth of the European population, there were more emigrants on the one hand to till the soil of the new countries, and, on the other, more workmen were available in Europe to prepare the industrial products and capital goods which were to maintain the emigrant populations in their new homes, and to build the railways and ships which, page 10, were to make accessible to Europe food and raw products from distant sources. Up to about 1900, a unit of labor applied to industry yielded year by year a purchasing power over an increasing quantity of food. It is possible that about the year 1900 this process began to be reversed, and the diminishing yield of nature to man's effort was beginning to reassert itself. But the tendency of cereals to rise in real cost was balanced by other improvements, and, one of many novelties, the resources of tropical Africa then for the first time came into large employ, and a great traffic in oilseeds began to bring to the table of Europe in a new and cheaper form one of the essential foodstuffs of mankind. In this economic Eldorado, in this economic utopia, as the earlier economists would have deemed it, most of us were brought up. That happy age lost sight of a view of the world which filled with deep-seated melancholy the founders of our political economy. Before the 18th century, mankind entertained no false hopes. To lay the illusions which grew popular at that age's latter end, Malthus disclosed a devil. For half a century, all serious economical writings held the devil in clear prospect. For the next half-century he was chained up and out of sight. Now perhaps we have loosed him again. What an extraordinary episode in the economic page 11. Progress of Man, that age was which came to an end in August 1914. The greater part of the population, it is true, worked hard and lived at a low standard of comfort, yet were, to all appearances, reasonably contented with this lot. But escape was possible, for any man of capacity or character at all exceeding the average, into the middle and upper classes, for whom life offered, at a low cost and with the least trouble, conveniences, comforts, and amenities beyond the compass of the richest and most powerful monarchs of other ages. The inhabitant of London could order by telephone, sipping his morning tea in bed, the various products of the whole earth, in such quantity as he might see fit, and reasonably expect their early delivery upon his doorstep. He could at the same moment and by the same means adventure his wealth in the natural resources and new enterprises of any quarter of the world, and share, without exertion or even trouble, in their prospective fruits and advantages. Or he could decide to couple the security of his fortunes with the good faith of the townspeople of any substantial municipality in any continent that fancy or information might recommend. He could secure forthwith, if he wished it, cheap and comfortable means of transit to any country or climate without passport or other formality, could dispatch his servant to the neighboring office of a bank, page 12, for such supply of the precious metals as might seem convenient, and could then proceed abroad to foreign quarters, without knowledge of their religion, language, or customs, bearing coined wealth upon his person, and would consider himself greatly aggrieved and much surprised at the least interference. But, most important of all, he regarded this state of affairs as normal, certain, and permanent, except in the direction of further improvement, and any deviation from it as aberrant, scandalous, and avoidable. The projects and politics of militarism and imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, of monopolies, restrictions, and exclusion, which were to play the serpent to this paradise, were little more than the amusements of his daily newspaper, and appeared to exercise almost no influence at all on the ordinary course of social and economic life, the internationalization of which was nearly complete in practice. It will assist us to appreciate the character and consequences of the peace which we have imposed on our enemies, if I elucidate a little further some of the chief unstable elements, already present when war broke out, in the economic life of Europe. Population in 1870 Germany had a population of about 40 million. By 1892 this figure had risen to 50 million, page 13, and by June 30th, 1914, to about 68 million. In the years immediately preceding the war, the annual increase was about 850,000, of whom an insignificant proportion emigrated. This great increase was only rendered possible by a far-reaching transformation of the economic structure of the country. From being agricultural and mainly self-supporting, Germany transformed herself into a vast and complicated industrial machine, dependent for its working on the equipoise of many factors outside Germany as well as within. Only by operating this machine, continuously and at full blast, could she find occupation at home for her increasing population and the means of purchasing their subsistence from abroad. The German machine was like a top which to maintain its equilibrium must spin ever faster and faster. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which grew from about 40 million in 1890 to at least 50 million at the outbreak of war, the same tendency was present in a less degree, the annual excess of births over deaths being about 500,000, out of which, however, there was an annual emigration of some 250,000 persons. To understand the present situation, we must apprehend with vividness what an extraordinary, page 14, center of population the development of the Germanic system had enabled Central Europe to become. Before the war, the population of Germany and Austria-Hungary together not only substantially exceeded that of the United States, but was about equal to that of the whole of North America. In these numbers, situated within a compact territory, lay the military strength of the Central Powers. But these same numbers, for even the war has not appreciably diminished them too, if deprived of the means of life, remain a hardly less danger to European order. European Russia increased her population in a degree even greater than Germany, from less than 100 million in 1890 to about 150 million at the outbreak of war. And in the year immediately preceding 1914, the excess of births over deaths in Russia as a whole was at the prodigious rate of 2 millions per annum. This inordinate growth in the population of Russia, which has not been widely noticed in England, has been nevertheless one of the most significant facts of recent years. The great events of history are often due to secular changes in the growth of population and, page 15, other fundamental economic causes, which, escaping by the gradual character the notice of contemporary observers, are attributed to the follies of statesmen or the fanaticism of atheists. Thus, the extraordinary occurrences of the past 2 years in Russia, that vast upheaval of society, which has overturned what seemed most stable, religion, the basis of property, the ownership of land, as well as forms of government and the hierarchy of classes, may owe more to the deep influences of expanding numbers than to Lenin or to Nicholas, and the disruptive powers of excessive national fecundity may have played a greater part in bursting the bonds of convention than either the power of ideas or the errors of autocracy. 2. Organization. The delicate organization by which these peoples lived depended partly on factors internal to the system. The interference of frontiers and of tariffs was reduced to a minimum, and not far short of 300 millions of people lived within the three empires of Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. The various currencies, which were all maintained on a stable basis in relation to gold and to one another, facilitated the easy flow of, page 16, capital and of trade to an extent the full value of which we only realize now, when we are deprived of its advantages. Over this great area there was an almost absolute security of property and of person. These factors of order, security, and uniformity, which Europe had never before enjoyed over so wide and populous a territory or for so long a period, prepared the way for the organization of that vast mechanism of transport, coal distribution, and foreign trade which made possible an industrial order of life in the dense urban centers of new population. This is too well known to require detailed substantiation with figures, but it may be illustrated by the figures for coal, which has been the key to the industrial growth of Central Europe hardly less than of England. The output of German coal grew from 30 million tons in 1871 to 70 million tons in 1890, 110 million tons in 1900, and 190 million tons in 1913. Round Germany as a central support the rest of the European economic system grouped itself, and on the prosperity and enterprise of Germany the prosperity of the rest of the continent mainly depended. The increasing pace of Germany gave her neighbors an outlet for their products, in exchange for which the enterprise of the German merchants supplied them with the chief requirements at a low price. Page 17. The statistics of the economic interdependence of Germany and her neighbors are overwhelming. Germany was the best customer of Russia, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. She was the second best customer of Great Britain, Sweden, and Denmark, and the third best customer of France. She was the largest source of supply to Russia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, Switzerland, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and the second largest source of supply to Great Britain, Belgium, and France. In our own case, we sent more exports to Germany than to any other country in the world except India, and we bought more from her than from any other country in the world except the United States. There was no European country except those west of Germany which did not do more than a quarter of the total trade with her, and in the case of Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Holland the proportion was far greater. Germany not only furnished these countries with trade, but, in the case of some of them, supplied a great part of the capital needed for their own development. Of Germany's pre-war foreign investments, amounting in all to about $6,250,000,000, not far short of $2,500,000,000 was invested in Russia, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, page 18, and Turkey. For and by the system of peaceful penetration, she gave these countries not only capital, but, what they needed hardly less, organization. The whole of Europe east of the Rhine thus fell into the German industrial orbit, and its economic life was adjusted accordingly. But these internal factors would not have been sufficient to enable the population to support itself without the cooperation of external factors also and of certain general dispositions common to the whole of Europe. Many of the circumstances already treated were true of Europe as a whole, and were not peculiar to the Central Empires. But all of what follows was common to the whole European system. 3. The psychology of society Europe was so organized socially and economically as to secure the maximum accumulation of capital. While there was some continuous improvement in the daily conditions of life of the mass of the population, society was so framed as to throw a great part of the increased income into the control of the class least likely to consume it. The new rich of the 19th century were not brought up to large expenditures, and preferred, page 19, the power which investment gave them to the pleasures of immediate consumption. In fact, it was precisely the inequality of the distribution of wealth which made possible those vast accumulations of fixed wealth and of capital improvements which distinguished that age from all others. Herein lay, in fact, the main justification of the capitalist system. If the rich had spent their new wealth on their own enjoyments, the world would long ago have found such a regime intolerable. But like bees they saved and accumulated, not less to the advantage of the whole community because they themselves held narrower ends in prospect. The immense accumulations of fixed capital which, to the great benefit of mankind, were built up during the half-century before the war, could never have come about in a society where wealth was divided equitably. The railways of the world, which that age built as a monument to posterity, were, not less than the pyramids of Egypt, the work of labor which was not free to consume in immediate enjoyment the full equivalent of its efforts. Thus this remarkable system depended for its growth on a double bluff or deception. On the one hand, the laboring classes accepted from ignorance or powerlessness, or were compelled, persuaded, or cajoled by custom, convention, authority, and, page 20, the well-established order of society into accepting a situation in which they could call their own very little of the cake that they in nature and the capitalists were co-operating to produce. And on the other hand, the capitalist classes were allowed to call the best part of the cake theirs and were theoretically free to consume it, on the tacit underlying condition that they consumed very little of it in practice. The duty of saving became 9/10 of virtue, and the growth of the cake the object of true religion. There grew round the non-consumption of the cake all those instincts of Puritanism which in other ages has withdrawn itself from the world and has neglected the arts of production as well as those of enjoyment. And so the cake increased, but to what end was not clearly contemplated. Individuals would be exhorted not so much to abstain as to defer, and to cultivate the pleasures of security and anticipation. Saving was for old age or for your children, but this was only in theory. The virtue of the cake was that it was never to be consumed, neither by you nor by your children after you. In writing thus I do not necessarily disparage the practices of that generation. In the unconscious recesses of its being society knew what it was about. The cake was really very small in proportion to the appetites of consumption, and no one, if it were shared all round, would be, page 21, much the better off by the cutting of it. Society was working not for the small pleasures of today, but for the future security and improvement of the race, in fact for progress. If only the cake were not cut, but was allowed to grow in the geometrical proportion predicted by Malthus of population, but not less true of compound interest, perhaps a day might come when there would at last be enough to go round, and when posterity could enter into the enjoyment of our labors. In that day overwork, overcrowding, and underfeeding would have come to an end, and men, secure of the comforts and necessities of the body, could proceed to the nobler exercises of their faculties. One geometrical ratio might cancel another, and the 19th century was able to forget the fertility of the species in a contemplation of the dizzy virtues of compound interest. There were two pitfalls in this prospect. Lest, population still outstripping accumulation, our self-denials promote not happiness but numbers, and lest the cake be after all consumed, prematurely, in war, the consumer of all such hopes. But these thoughts lead too far from my present purpose. I seek only to point out that the principle of accumulation based on inequality was a vital part of the pre-war order of society and of progress as we then understood it, and to emphasize that this principle depended on unstable, page 22, psychological conditions, which it may be impossible to recreate. It was not natural for a population, of whom so few enjoyed the comforts of life, to accumulate so hugely. The war has disclosed the possibility of consumption to all and the vanity of abstinence to many. Thus, the bluff is discovered. The laboring classes may be no longer willing to forego so largely, and the capitalist classes, no longer confident of the future, may seek to enjoy more fully their liberties of consumption so long as they last, and thus precipitate the hour of their confiscation. IV. The relation of the Old World to the newly accumulative habits of Europe before the war were the necessary condition of the greatest of the external factors which maintained the European equipoise. Of the surplus capital goods accumulated by Europe, a substantial part was exported abroad, where its investment made possible the development of the new resources of food, materials, and transport, and at the same time enabled the Old World to stake out a claim in the natural wealth and virgin potentialities of the New. This last factor came to be of the vastest importance. The Old World employed with an immense prudence the annual tribute it, page 23, was thus entitled to draw. The benefit of cheap and abundant supplies, resulting from the new developments which its surplus capital had made possible, was, it is true, enjoyed and not postponed. But the greater part of the money interest accruing on these foreign investments was reinvested and allowed to accumulate, as a reserve, it was then hoped, against the less happy day when the industrial labor of Europe could no longer purchase on such easy terms the produce of other continents, and when the due balance would be threatened between its historical civilizations and the multiplying races of other climates and environments. Thus, the whole of the European races tended to benefit alike from the development of new resources, whether they pursued their culture at home or adventured it abroad. Even before the war, however, the equilibrium thus established between old civilizations and new resources was being threatened. The prosperity of Europe was based on the facts that, owing to the large exportable surplus of foodstuffs in America, she was able to purchase food at a cheap rate measured in terms of the labor required to produce her own exports, and that, as a result of her previous investments of capital, she was entitled to a substantial amount annually without any payment in return at all. The second of these factors then seemed out of danger, but, as a result, page 24, of the growth of population overseas, chiefly in the United States, the first was not so secure. When first the virgin soils of America came into bearing, the proportions of the population of those continents themselves, and consequently of their own local requirements, to those of Europe were very small. As lately as 1890, Europe had a population 3 times that of North and South America added together. But by 1914, the domestic requirements of the United States for wheat were approaching their production, and the date was evidently near when there would be an exportable surplus only in years of exceptionally favorable harvest. Indeed, the present domestic requirements of the United States are estimated at more than 90% of the average yield of the 5 years 1909 minus 1913.5 at that time. However, the tendency towards stringency was showing itself, not so much in a lack of abundance as in a steady increase of real cost. That is to say, taking the world as a whole, there was no deficiency of wheat, but in order to call forth an adequate page 25 supply it was necessary to offer a higher real price. The most favorable factor in the situation was to be found in the extent to which Central and Western Europe was being fed from the exportable surplus of Russia and Romania. In short, Europe's claim on the resources of the New World was becoming precarious. The law of diminishing returns was at last reasserting itself, and was making it necessary year by year for Europe to offer a greater quantity of other commodities to obtain the same amount of bread, and Europe, therefore, could by no means afford the disorganization of any of her principal sources of supply. Much else might be said in an attempt to portray the economic peculiarities of the Europe of 1914. I have selected for emphasis the 3 or 4 greatest factors of instability: the instability of an excessive population dependent for its livelihood on a complicated and artificial organization, the psychological instability of the laboring in capitalist classes, and the instability of Europe's claim, coupled with the completeness of her dependence, on the food supplies of the New World. The war had so shaken this system as to endanger the life of Europe altogether. A great part of the continent was sick and dying. Its population was greatly in excess of the numbers for page 26, which a livelihood was available. Its organization was destroyed, its transport system ruptured, and its food supplies terribly impaired. It was the task of the peace conference to honor engagements and to satisfy justice, but not less to re-establish life and to heal wounds. These tasks were dictated as much by prudence as by the magnanimity which the wisdom of antiquity approved in victors. We will examine in the following chapters the actual character of the peace. Europe after the treaty. This chapter must be one of pessimism. The treaty includes no provisions for the economic rehabilitation of Europe, nothing to make the defeated Central Empires into good neighbors, nothing to stabilize the new states of Europe, nothing to reclaim Russia, nor does it promote in any way a compact of economic solidarity amongst the Allies themselves. No arrangement was reached at Paris for restoring the disordered finances of France and Italy, or to adjust the systems of the Old World and the New. The Council of Four paid no attention to these issues, being preoccupied with others: Clemenceau to crush the economic life of his enemy, Lloyd George to do a deal and bring home something which would pass muster for a week, the President to do nothing that was not just and right. It is an extraordinary fact that the fundamental economic problems of a Europe starving and disintegrating before their eyes was the one question in which it was impossible to arouse the interest of the Four. Reparation was their main excursion into the economic field, and they settled page 227. It is a problem of theology, of politics, of electoral chicane, from every point of view except that of the economic future of the states whose destiny they were handling. I leave, from this point onwards, Paris, the conference, and the treaty, briefly to consider the present situation of Europe, as the war and the peace have made it, and it will no longer be part of my purpose to distinguish between the inevitable fruits of the war and the avoidable misfortunes of the peace. The essential facts of the situation, as I see them, are expressed simply. Europe consists of the densest aggregation of population in the history of the world. This population is accustomed to a relatively high standard of life, in which, even now, some sections of it anticipate improvement rather than deterioration. In relation to other continents, Europe is not self-sufficient; in particular, it cannot feed itself. Internally, the population is not evenly distributed, but much of it is crowded into a relatively small number of dense industrial centers. This population secured for itself a livelihood before the war, without much margin of surplus, by means of a delicate and immensely complicated organization, of which the foundations were supported by coal, iron, transport, and an unbroken supply of imported food and raw materials from other continents. By the destruction, page 228, of this organization and the interruption of the stream of supplies, a part of this population is deprived of its means of livelihood. Emigration is not open to the redundant surplus, for it would take years to transport them overseas, even, which is not the case, if countries could be found which were ready to receive them. The danger confronting us, therefore, is the rapid depression of the standard of life of the European populations to a point which will mean actual starvation for some, a point already reached in Russia and approximately reached in Austria. Men will not always die quietly, for starvation, which brings to some lethargy and a helpless despair, drives other temperaments to the nervous instability of hysteria and to a mad despair. And these in their distress may overturn the remnants of organization and submerge civilization itself in their attempts to satisfy desperately the overwhelming needs of the individual. This is the danger against which all our resources and courage and idealism must now cooperate. On the 13th of May 1919, Count Brockdorff-Rantzau addressed to the Peace Conference of the Allied and Associated Powers the report of the German Economic Commission charged with the study of the effect of the conditions of peace on the situation of the German population. In the course of the last two generations, they reported, page 229, Germany has become transformed from an agricultural state to an industrial state. So long as she was an agricultural state, Germany could feed 40 million inhabitants. As an industrial state, she could ensure the means of subsistence for a population of 67 millions, and in 1913 the importation of foodstuffs amounted, in round figures, to 12 million tons. Before the war, a total of 15 million persons in Germany provided for their existence by foreign trade, navigation, and the use, directly or indirectly, of foreign raw material. After rehearsing the main relevant provisions of the peace treaty, the report continues. After this diminution of her products, after the economic depression resulting from the loss of her colonies, her merchant fleet and her foreign investments, Germany will not be in a position to import from abroad an adequate quantity of raw material. An enormous part of German industry will, therefore, be condemned inevitably to destruction. The need of importing foodstuffs will increase considerably at the same time that the possibility of satisfying this demand is as greatly diminished. In a very short time, therefore, Germany will not be in a position to give bread and work to her numerous millions of inhabitants, who are prevented from earning their livelihood by navigation and trade. These persons should emigrate, but this is a material impossibility, page 230. All the more because many countries and the most important ones will oppose any German immigration. To put the peace conditions into execution would logically involve, therefore, the loss of several millions of persons in Germany. This catastrophe would not be long in coming about, seeing that the health of the population has been broken down during the war by the blockade, and during the armistice by the aggravation of the blockade of famine. No help, however great, or over however long a period it were continued, could prevent these deaths en masse. We do not know, and indeed we doubt, the report concludes, whether the delegates of the Allied and Associated Powers realize the inevitable consequences which will take place if Germany, an industrial state, very thickly populated, closely bound up with the economic system of the world, and under the necessity of importing enormous quantities of raw material and foodstuffs, suddenly finds herself pushed back to the phase of her development, which corresponds to her economic condition and the numbers of her population as they were half a century ago. Those who sign this treaty will sign the death sentence of many millions of German men, women, and children. I know of no adequate answer to these words. The indictment is at least as true of the Austrian, page 231, as of the German, settlement. This is the fundamental problem in front of us, before which questions of territorial adjustment and the balance of European power are insignificant. Some of the catastrophes of past history, which have thrown back human progress for centuries, have been due to the reactions following on the sudden termination, whether in the course of nature or by the act of man, of temporarily favorable conditions which have permitted the growth of population beyond what could be provided for when the favorable conditions were at an end. The significant features of the immediate situation can be grouped under three heads. First, the absolute falling off, for the time being, in Europe's internal productivity. Second, the breakdown of transport and exchange by means of which its products could be conveyed where they were most wanted. And third, the inability of Europe to purchase its usual supplies from overseas. The decrease of productivity cannot be easily estimated, and may be the subject of exaggeration. But the prima facie evidence of it is overwhelming. and this factor has been the main burden of Mr. Hoover's well-considered warnings. A variety of causes have produced it. Violent and prolonged internal disorder, as in Russia and Hungary, the creation of new governments and their, page 232, inexperience in the readjustment of economic relations, as in Poland and Czechoslovakia, the loss throughout the continent of efficient labor, through the casualties of war or the continuance of mobilization, the falling off in efficiency through continued underfeeding in the central empires, the exhaustion of the soil from lack of the usual applications of artificial manures throughout the course of the war, the unsettlement of the minds of the laboring classes on the above all, to quote Mr. Hoover, there is a great fundamental economic issues of their lives. But relaxation of effort is the reflex of physical exhaustion of large sections of the population from privation and the mental and physical strain of the war. Many persons are for one reason or another out of employment altogether. According to Mr. Hoover, a summary of the unemployment bureaus in Europe in July 1919 showed that 15 million families were receiving unemployment allowances in one form or another, and were being paid in the main by a constant inflation of currency. In Germany, there is the added deterrent to labor and to capital, insofar as the reparation terms are taken literally, that anything which they may produce beyond the barest level of subsistence will for years to come be taken away from them. Such definite data as we possess do not add, page 233, much, perhaps, to the general picture of decay. But I will remind the reader of one or two of them. The coal production of Europe as a whole is estimated to have fallen off by 30%, and upon coal the greater part of the industries of Europe and the whole of her transport system depend. Whereas before the war Germany produced 85% of the total food consumed by her inhabitants, the productivity of the soil is now diminished by 40% and the effective quality of the livestock by 55%. 70 of the European countries which formerly possessed a large exportable surplus, Russia, as much by reason of deficient transport as of diminished output, may herself starve. Hungary, apart from her other troubles, has been pillaged by the Romanians immediately after harvest. Austria will have consumed the whole of her own harvest for 1919 before the end of the calendar year. The figures are almost too overwhelming to carry conviction to our minds. If they were not quite so bad, our effective belief in them might be stronger. But even when coal can be got and grain harvested, the breakdown of the European railway system prevents their carriage, and even when goods can be manufactured, the breakdown of the European currency system prevents their sale. Page 234, have already described the losses, by war and under the armistice surrenders, to the transport system of Germany. But even so, Germany's position, taking account of her power of replacement by manufacture, is probably not so serious as that of some of her neighbors. In Russia, about which, however, we have very little exact or accurate information, the condition of the rolling stock is believed to be altogether desperate, and one of the most fundamental factors in her existing economic disorder. And in Poland, Romania, and Hungary the position is not much better. Yet modern industrial life essentially depends on efficient transport facilities, and the population which secured its livelihood by these means cannot continue to live without them. The breakdown of currency, and the distrust in its purchasing value, is an aggravation of these evils which must be discussed in a little more detail in connection with foreign trade. What then is our picture of Europe? A country population able to support life on the fruits of its own agricultural production, but without the accustomed surplus for the towns, and also, as a result of the lack of imported materials and so of variety in amount in the saleable manufactures of the towns, without the usual incentives to market food in return for other wares, an industrial population unable to keep its strength for, page 235, lack of food, unable to earn a livelihood for lack of materials, and so unable to make good by imports from abroad the failure of productivity at home. Yet, according to Mr. Hoover, A rough estimate would indicate that the population of Europe is at least 100 million greater than can be supported without imports, and must live by the production and distribution of exports. The problem of the re-inauguration of the perpetual circle of production and exchange in foreign trade leads me to a necessary digression on the currency situation of Europe. Lenin is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens. By this method, they not only confiscate, but they confiscate arbitrarily, and, while the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some. The sight of this arbitrary rearrangement of riches strikes not only at security, but at confidence in the equity of the existing distribution of wealth. Those to whom the system brings windfalls, beyond their deserts and even beyond their expectations or desires, become profiteers, who are the object of the hatred of the bourgeoisie, whom the inflationism has impoverished, not less than of the proletariat. As the inflation proceeds, page 236, and the real value of the currency fluctuates wildly from month to month, all permanent relations between debtors and creditors, which form the ultimate foundation of capitalism, become so utterly disordered as to be almost meaningless, and the process of wealth getting degenerates into a gamble and a lottery. Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. In the latter stages of the war, all the belligerent governments practiced, from necessity or incompetence, what a Bolshevist might have done from design. Even now, when the war is over, most of them continue out of weakness the same malpractices. But further, the governments of Europe, being many of them at this moment reckless in their methods as well as weak, seek to direct on to a class known as profiteers the popular indignation against the more obvious consequences of the vicious methods. These profiteers are, broadly speaking, the entrepreneur class of capitalists, that is to say, the active and constructive element in the whole capitalist society, who in a period of rapidly rising prices, page 237, cannot help but get rich quick whether they wish it or desire it or not. If prices are continually rising, every trader who has purchased for stock or owns property and plant inevitably makes profits. By directing hatred against this class, therefore, the European governments are carrying a step further the fatal process which the subtle mind of Lenin had consciously conceived. The profiteers are a consequence and not a cause of rising prices. By combining a popular hatred of the class of entrepreneurs with the blow already given to social security by the violent and arbitrary disturbance of contract and of the established equilibrium of wealth, which is the inevitable result of inflation, these governments are fast rendering impossible a continuance of the social and economic order of the 19th century. But they have no plan for replacing it. We are thus faced in Europe with the spectacle of an extraordinary weakness on the part of the great capitalist class, which has emerged from the industrial triumphs of the 19th century, and seemed a very few years ago our all-powerful master. The terror and personal timidity of the individuals of this class is now so great, their confidence in their place in society and in their necessity to the social organism so diminished, that they are the easy victims of intimidation. Page 238. This was not so in England 25 years ago, any more than it is now in the United States. Then the capitalists believed in themselves, in their value to society, in the propriety of the continued existence in the full enjoyment of their riches and the unlimited exercise of their power. Now they tremble before every insult. Call them pro-Germans, international financiers, or profiteers, and they will give you any ransom you choose to ask not to speak of them so harshly. They allow themselves to be ruined and altogether undone by their own instruments, governments of their own making, and a press of which they are the proprietors. Perhaps it is historically true that no order of society ever perishes save by its own hand. In the complexer world of Western Europe, the immanent may achieve its ends more subtly and bring in the revolution no less inevitably through a Klotz or a George than by the intellectualisms, too ruthless and self-conscious for us, of the bloodthirsty philosophers of Russia. The inflationism of the currency systems of Europe has proceeded to extraordinary lengths. The various belligerent governments, unable, or too timid or too short-sighted to secure from loans or taxes the resources they required, have printed notes for the balance. In Russia and Austria-Hungary this process has reached a point where, page 239, for the purposes of foreign trade the currency is practically valueless. The Polish mark can be bought for about 3 cents and the Austrian crown for less than 2 cents, but they cannot be sold at all. The German mark is worth less than 4 cents on the exchanges. In most of the other countries of Eastern and Southeastern Europe, the real position is nearly as bad. The currency of Italy has fallen to little more than a half of its nominal value in spite of its being still subject to some degree of regulation. French currency maintains an uncertain market, and even sterling is seriously diminished in present value and impaired in its future prospects. But while these currencies enjoy a precarious value abroad, they have never entirely lost, not even in Russia, their purchasing power at home. A sentiment of trust in the legal money of the state is so deeply implanted in the citizens of all countries that they cannot but believe that someday this money must recover a part at least of its former value. To their minds it appears that value is inherent in money as such, and they do not apprehend that the real wealth, which this money might have stood for, has been dissipated once and for all. This sentiment is supported by the various legal regulations with which the governments endeavor to control internal prices, and so to preserve some purchasing power for their, page 240, legal tender. Thus, the force of law preserves a measure of immediate purchasing power over some commodities, and the force of sentiment and custom maintains, especially amongst peasants, a willingness to hoard paper which is really worthless. The presumption of a spurious value for the currency, by the force of law expressed in the regulation of prices, contains in itself, however, the seeds of final economic decay, and soon dries up the sources of ultimate supply. If a man is compelled to exchange the fruits of his labors for paper which, as experience soon teaches him, he cannot use to purchase what he requires at a price comparable to that which he has received for his own products, he will keep his produce for himself, dispose of it to his friends and neighbors as a favor, or relax his efforts in producing it. A system of compelling the exchange of commodities at what is not their real relative value not only relaxes production, but leads finally to the waste and inefficiency of barter. If, however, a government refrains from regulation and allows matters to take their course, essential commodities soon attain a level of price out of the reach of all but the rich, the worthlessness of the money becomes apparent, and the fraud upon the public can be concealed no longer. The effect on foreign trade of price regulation, page 241, and profiteer hunting as cures for inflation is even worse. Whatever may be the case at home, the currency must soon reach its real level abroad, with the result that prices inside and outside the country lose their normal adjustment. The price of imported commodities, when converted at the current rate of exchange, is far in excess of the local price, so that many essential goods will not be imported at all by private agency, and must be provided by the government, which, in reselling the goods below cost price, plunges thereby a little further into insolvency. The bread subsidies, now almost universal throughout Europe, are the leading example of this phenomenon. The countries of Europe fall into two distinct groups at the present time as regards their manifestations of what is really the same evil throughout, according as they have been cut off from international intercourse by the blockade, or have had their imports paid for out of the resources of their allies. I take Germany as typical of the first, and France and Italy of the second. The note circulation of Germany is about 10 times 71 what it was before the war. The value of the mark in terms of gold is about 1/8 of its former value. As world prices in terms of gold are more than double what they were, it follows, page 242, that mark prices inside Germany ought to be from 16 to 20 times their pre-war level if they are to be in adjustment and proper conformity with prices outside Germany. 72. But this is not the case. In spite of a very great rise in German prices, they probably do not yet average much more than 5 times their former level, so far as staple commodities are concerned, and it is impossible that they should rise further except with a simultaneous and not less violent adjustment of the level of money wages. The existing maladjustment hinders in two ways, apart from other obstacles, that revival of the import trade which is the essential preliminary of the economic reconstruction of the country. In the first place, imported commodities are beyond the purchasing power of the great mass of the population, 73, and the flood of imports which might have been expected to succeed the raising of the blockade was not in fact commercially possible. 74. In the second place, it is a hazardous enterprise for a merchant or a manufacturer to purchase with a foreign page 243 credit material for which, when he has imported it or manufactured it, he will receive marked currency of a quite uncertain and possibly unrealizable value. This latter obstacle to the revival of trade is one which easily escapes notice and deserves a little attention. It is impossible at the present time to say what the mark will be worth in terms of foreign currency 3 or 6 months or a year hence, and the exchange market can quote no reliable figure. It may be the case, therefore, that a German merchant, careful of his future credit and reputation, who is actually offered a short period credit in terms of sterling or dollars, may be reluctant and doubtful whether to accept it. He will owe sterling or dollars, but he will sell his product for marks, and his power, when the time comes, to turn these marks into the currency in which he has to repay his debt is entirely problematic. Business loses its genuine character and becomes no better than a speculation in the exchanges, the fluctuations in which entirely obliterate the normal profits of commerce. There are therefore three separate obstacles to the revival of trade: a maladjustment between internal prices and international prices, a lack of individual credit abroad wherewith to buy the raw materials needed to secure the working capital and to restart the circle of exchange, and a disordered, page 244, currency system which renders credit operations hazardous or impossible quite apart from the ordinary risks of commerce. The note circulation of France is more than 6 times its pre-war level. The exchange value of the franc in terms of gold is a little less than 2/3 its former value. That is to say, the value of the franc has not fallen in proportion to the increased volume of the currency. 75. This apparently superior situation of France is due to the fact that until recently a very great part of her imports have not been paid for, but have been covered by loans from the governments of Great Britain and the United States. This has allowed a want of equilibrium between exports and imports to be established, which is becoming a very serious factor, now that the outside assistance is being gradually discontinued. The internal economy of France and its price level in relation to the note circulation and the foreign exchanges is at present based on an excess of imports over exports which cannot possibly continue. Yet it is difficult to see how the position can be readjusted except by a lowering of the standard of consumption in France, which, even if it is, page 245, only temporary, will provoke a great deal of discontent. 76. The situation of Italy is not very different. There the note circulation is 5 or 6 times its pre-war level, and the exchange value of the lira in terms of gold about half its former value. Thus, the adjustment of the exchange to the volume of the note circulation has proceeded further in Italy than in France. On the other hand, Italy's invisible receipts from emigrant remittances and the expenditure of tourists have been very injuriously affected. The disruption of Austria has deprived her of an important market, and her peculiar dependence on foreign shipping and on imported raw materials of every kind has laid her open to special injury from the increase of world prices. For all these reasons her position, page 246, is grave, and her excessive imports as serious a symptom as in the case of France. 77. The existing inflation and the maladjustment of international trade are aggravated, both in France and in Italy, by the unfortunate budgetary position of the governments of these countries. In France, the failure to impose taxation is notorious. Before the war, the aggregate French and British budgets, and also the average taxation per head, were about equal, but in France no substantial effort has been made to cover the increased expenditure. Taxes increased in Great Britain during the war, it has been estimated, from 95 francs per head to 265 francs, whereas the increase in France was only from 90 to 103 francs. The taxation voted in France for the financial year ending June 30th, 1919, was less than half the estimated normal post-bellum expenditure. The normal budget for the future cannot be put below $4,400,000,000, 22 million francs, and may exceed this figure. But even for the fiscal year 1919-20, the estimated receipts from taxation, page 247, do not cover much more than half this amount. The French Ministry of Finance have no plan or policy whatever for meeting this prodigious deficit, except the expectation of receipts from Germany on a scale which the French officials themselves know to be baseless. In the meantime, they are helped by sales of war material and surplus American stocks and do not scruple, even in the latter half of 1919, to meet the deficit by the yet further expansion of the note issue of the Bank of France. 78. The budgetary position of Italy is perhaps a little superior to that of France. Italian finance throughout the war was more enterprising than the French, and far greater efforts were made to impose taxation and pay for the war. Nevertheless, Signor Nitti, the Prime Minister, in a letter addressed to the electorate on the eve of the general election, October 1919, thought it necessary to make public the following desperate analysis of the situation. 1. The state expenditure amounts to about 3 times the revenue. 2. All the industrial undertakings of the state, including the railways, telegraphs, and telephones, are being run at a loss. Although the public is buying bread at a high price, that price represents, page 248, a loss to the government of about $1 million a year. 3. Exports now leaving the country are valued at only 1/4 or 1/5 of the imports from abroad. 4. The national debt is increasing by about $1 million lira per month. 5. The military expenditure for 1 month is still larger than that for the first year of the war. But if this is the budgetary position of France and Italy, that of the rest of belligerent Europe is yet more desperate. In Germany, the total expenditure of the Empire, the federal states, and the communes in 1919-20 is estimated at 25 milliards of marks, of which not above 10 milliards are covered by previously existing taxation. This is without allowing anything for the payment of the indemnity. In Russia, Poland, Hungary, or Austria, such a thing as a budget cannot be seriously considered to exist at all. 79. Thus, the menace of inflationism described above is not merely a product of the war, of which peace begins the cure. It is a continuing phenomenon of which the end is not yet in sight. All these influences combine not merely to prevent, page 249, Europe from supplying immediately a sufficient stream of exports to pay for the goods she needs to import, but they impair her credit for securing the working capital required to restart the circle of exchange, and also, by swinging the forces of economic law yet further from equilibrium rather than towards it, they favor a continuance of the present conditions instead of a recovery from them. An inefficient, unemployed, disorganized Europe faces us, torn by internal strife and international hate, fighting, starving, pillaging, and lying. What warrant is there for a picture of less somber colors? I have paid little heed in this book to Russia, Hungary, or Austria. 80. There the miseries of life and the disintegration of society are too notorious to require analysis, and these countries are already experiencing the actuality of what for the rest of Europe is still in the realm of prediction. Yet they comprehend a vast territory and a great page, 250, population, and are an extant example of how much man can suffer and how far society can decay. Above all, they are the signal to us of how in the final catastrophe the malady of the body passes over into malady of the mind. Economic privation proceeds by easy stages, and so long as men suffer it patiently the outside world cares little. Physical efficiency and resistance to disease slowly diminish. 81. But life proceeds somehow. Page 251. Until the limit of human endurance is reached at last, and counsels of despair and madness stir the sufferers from the lethargy which precedes the crisis. Then man shakes himself, and the bonds of custom are loosed. The power of ideas is sovereign, and he listens to whatever instruction of hope, illusion, or revenge is carried to him on the air. As I write, the flames of Russian Bolshevism seem, for the moment at least, to have burnt themselves out, and the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe are held in a dreadful torpor. The lately gathered harvest keeps off the worst privations, and peace has been declared at Paris. But winter approaches. Men will have nothing to look forward to or to nourish hopes on. There will be little fuel to moderate the rigors of the season or to comfort the starved bodies of the town dwellers. But who can say how much is endurable, or in what direction men will seek at last to escape from their misfortunes? Page 252, Chapter 7. Remedies. It is difficult to maintain true perspective in large affairs. I have criticized the work of Paris, and have depicted in somber colors the condition and the prospects of Europe. This is one aspect of the position and, I believe, a true one. But in so complex a phenomenon the prognostics do not all point one way, and we may make the error of expecting consequences to follow too swiftly and too inevitably from what perhaps are not all the relevant causes. The blackness of the prospect itself leads us to doubt its accuracy. Our imagination is dulled rather than stimulated by too woeful a narration, and our minds rebound from what is felt too bad to be true. But before the reader allows himself to be too much swayed by these natural reflections, and before I lead him, as is the intention of this chapter, towards remedies and ameliorations and the discovery of happier tendencies, let him redress the balance of his thought by recalling two contrasts, England and Russia, of which the one may encourage his optimism too much, but the other should remind him that catastrophes can, page 253, still happen, and that modern society is not immune from the very greatest evils. In the chapters of this book I have not generally had in mind the situation or the problems of England. Europe, in my narration, must generally be interpreted to exclude the British Isles. England is in a state of transition, and her economic problems are serious. We may be on the eve of great changes in her social and industrial structure. Some of us may welcome such prospects and some of us deplore them. But they are of a different kind altogether from those impending on Europe. I do not perceive in England the slightest possibility of catastrophe or any serious likelihood of a general upheaval of society. The war has impoverished us, but not seriously. I should judge that the real wealth of the country in 1919 is at least equal to what it was in 1900. Our balance of trade is adverse, but not so much so that the readjustment of it need disorder our economic life. 82. The deficit in page 254. Our budget is large, but not beyond what firm and prudent statesmanship could bridge. The shortening of the hours of labor may have somewhat diminished our productivity, but it should not be too much to hope that this is a feature of transition, and no one who is acquainted with the British workingman can doubt that, if it suits him, and if he is in sympathy and reasonable contentment with the conditions of his life, he can produce at least as much in a shorter working day as he did in the longer hours which prevailed formerly. The most serious problems for England have been brought to a head by the war, but are in their origins more fundamental. The forces of the 19th century have run their course and are exhausted. The economic motives and ideals of that generation no longer satisfy us. We must find a new way and must suffer again the malaise, and finally the pangs, of a new industrial birth. This is one element. The other is that on which I have enlarged in Chapter 2. The increase in the real cost of food and the diminishing response of nature to any further increase in the population of the world, a tendency which must be especially injurious to the page 255, greatest of all industrial countries and the most dependent on imported supplies of food. But these secular problems are such as no age is free from. They are of an altogether different order from those which may afflict the peoples of Central Europe. Those readers who, chiefly mindful of the British conditions with which they are familiar, are apt to indulge their optimism, and still more those whose immediate environment is American, must cast their minds to Russia, Turkey, Hungary, or Austria, where the most dreadful material evils which men can suffer, famine, cold, disease, war, murder, and anarchy, are an actual present experience, if they are to apprehend the character of the misfortunes against the further extension of which it must surely be our duty to seek the remedy, if there is one. What then is to be done? The tentative suggestions of this chapter may appear to the reader inadequate. But the opportunity was missed at Paris during the 6 months which followed the armistice, and nothing we can do now can repair the mischief wrought at that time. Great privation and great risks to society have become unavoidable. All that is now open to us is to redirect, so far as lies in our power, the fundamental economic tendencies which underlie the events of the hour, so that they promote the re-establishment, page 256, of prosperity and order, instead of leading us deeper into misfortune. We must first escape from the atmosphere and the methods of Paris. Those who control the conference may bow before the gusts of popular opinion, but they will never lead us out of our troubles. It is hardly to be supposed that the Council of Four can retrace their steps, even if they wish to do so. The replacement of the existing governments of Europe is, therefore, an almost indispensable preliminary. I propose then to discuss a program for those who believe that the Peace of Versailles cannot stand, under the following heads. 1. The revision of the treaty. 2. The settlement of inter-ally indebtedness. 3. An international loan and the reform of the currency. 4. The relations of Central Europe to Russia. The consequences to society of changes in the value of money edited for audiobook presentation. A truth, peace loves public service. Money is only important for what it will procure. Thus, a change in the monetary unit, which is uniform in its operation and affects all transactions equally, has no consequences. If, by a change in the established standard of value, a man received and owned twice as much money as he did before in payment for all rights and for all efforts, and if he also paid out twice as much money for all acquisitions and for all satisfactions, he would be wholly unaffected. It follows, therefore, that a change in the value of money, that is to say in the level of prices, is important to society only in so far as its incidence is unequal. Such changes have produced in the past, and are producing now, the vastest social consequences, because, as we all know, when the value of money changes, it does not change equally for all persons or for all purposes. A man's receipts and his outgoings are not all modified in one uniform proportion. Thus, a change in prices and rewards, too as measured in money, generally affects different classes unequally, transfers wealth from one to another, bestows affluence here and embarrassment there, and redistributes fortune's favors so as to frustrate design and disappoint expectation. The fluctuations in the value of money since 1914 have been on a scale so great as to constitute, with all that they involve, one of the most significant events in the economic history of the modern world. The fluctuation of the standard, whether gold, silver, or paper, has not only been of unprecedented violence, but has been visited on a society of which the economic organization is more dependent than that of any earlier epoch on the assumption that the standard of value would be moderately stable. During the Napoleonic Wars and the period immediately succeeding him, the extreme fluctuation of English prices within a single year was 22%, and the highest price level reached during the first quarter of the 19th century, which we use to reckon the most disturbed period of our currency history, was less than double the lowest and with an interval of 13 years. Compare with this the extraordinary movements of the past 9 years. To recall the reader's mind to the exact facts, I refer him to the table on the next page. I have not included those countries, Russia, Poland, and Austria, where the old currency has long been bankrupt. But it will be observed that, even apart from the countries which have suffered revolution or defeat, no quarter of the world has escaped a violent movement. In the United States, where the gold standard has functioned unabated, in Japan, where the war brought with it more profit than liability, in the neutral country of Sweden, the changes in the value of money have been comparable with those in the United Kingdom. United Kingdom rose to 295% high and flattened to 159%. France peaked at 510% in the year after treaty. Italy's wholesale price index exploded to sixfold. Germany prices rose more than 100 times after the treaty and would see hyperinflation given hindsight. USA, Canada, Japan, and Sweden had doubled their wholesale prices 10 years after the beginning of the Great War. From 1914 to 1920, all these countries experienced an expansion in the supply of money to spend relatively to the supply of things to purchase, that is to say, inflation. Since 1920, those countries which have regained control of their financial situation, not content with bringing the inflation to an end, have contracted their supply of money and have experienced the fruits of deflation. Others have followed inflationary courses more riotously than before. In a few, of which Italy is one, an imprudent desire to deflate has been balanced by the intractability of the financial situation, with the happy result of comparatively stable prices. Each process, inflation and deflation alike, has inflicted great injuries. Each has an effect in altering the distribution of wealth between different classes, inflation in this respect being the worst of the two. Each has also an effect in overstimulating or retarding the production of wealth, though here deflation is the more injurious. The division of our subject thus indicated is the most convenient for us to follow, examining first the effect of changes in the value of money on the distribution of wealth, with most of our attention on inflation, and next their effect on the production of wealth, with most of our attention on deflation. How have the price changes of the past 9 years affected the productivity of the community as a whole, and how have they affected the conflicting interests and mutual relations of its component classes? The answer to these questions will serve to establish the gravity of the evils, into the remedy for which it is the object of this book to inquire. 5. Changes in the value of money. As affecting distribution for the purpose of this inquiry, a triple classification of society is convenient, into the investing class, the business class, and the earning class. These classes overlap, and the same individual may earn, deal, and invest. But in the present organization of society, such a division corresponds to a social cleavage and an actual divergence of interest. 1. The investing class. Of the various purposes which money serves, some essentially depend upon the assumption that its real value is nearly constant over a period of time. The chief of these are those connected, in a wide sense, with contracts for the investment of money. Such contracts, namely, those which provide for the payment of fixed sums of money over a long period of time, are the characteristic of what it is convenient to call the investment system, as distinct from the property system generally. Under this phase of capitalism, as developed during the 19th century, many arrangements were devised for separating the management of property from its ownership. These arrangements were of three leading types. 1. Those in which the proprietor, while parting with the management of his property, retained his ownership of it, i.e., of the actual land, buildings, and machinery, or of whatever else it consisted in, this mode of tenure being typified by a holding of ordinary shares in a joint stock company. 2. Those in which he parted with the property temporarily, receiving a fixed sum of money annually in the meantime, but regained his property eventually, as typified by a lease. And 3. Those in which he parted with his real property permanently, in return either for a perpetual annuity fixed in terms of money, or for a terminable annuity and the repayment of the principal in money at the end of the term, as typified by mortgages, bonds, debentures, and preference shares. This third type represents the full development of investment. Contracts to receive fixed sums of money at future dates, made without provision for possible changes in the real value of money at those dates, must have existed as long as money has been lent and borrowed, in the form of leases and mortgages, and also of permanent loans to governments and to a few private bodies, such as the East India Company. They were already frequent in the 18th century. But during the 19th century, they developed a new and increased importance, and had, by the beginning of the 20th, divided the propertied classes into two groups: the businessmen and the investors, with partly divergent interests. The division was not sharp as between individuals. The businessmen might be investors also, and investors might hold ordinary shares, but the division was nevertheless real, and not the less important because it was seldom noticed. By this system, the active business class could call to the aid of their enterprises not only their own wealth, but the savings of the whole community, and the professional and propertied classes, on the other hand, could find an employment for their resources, which involved them in little trouble, no responsibility, and, it was believed, small risk. For 100 years the system worked, throughout Europe, with an extraordinary success and facilitated the growth of wealth on an unprecedented scale. To save and to invest became at once the duty and the delight of a large class. The savings were seldom drawn on, and, accumulating at compound interest, made possible the material triumphs which we now all take for granted. The morals, the politics, the literature, and the religion of the age joined in a grand conspiracy for the promotion of saving. God and Mammon were reconciled. Peace on earth to men of good means. A rich man could, after all, enter into the kingdom of heaven, if only he saved. A new harmony sounded from the celestial spheres. It is curious to observe how, through the wise and beneficent arrangement of Providence, men thus do the greatest service to the public, when they are thinking of nothing but their own gain, so sang the angels. The atmosphere thus created well harmonized the demands of expanding business and the needs of an expanding population with the growth of a comfortable non-business class. But amidst the general enjoyment of ease and progress, the extent to which the system depended on the stability of the money to which the investing classes had committed their fortunes was generally overlooked, and an unquestioning confidence was apparently felt that this matter would look after itself. Investments spread and multiplied, until, for the middle classes of the world, the gilt-edged bond came to typify all that was most permanent and most secure. So rooted in our day has been the conventional belief in the stability and safety of a money contract that, according to English law, trustees have been encouraged to embark their trust funds exclusively in such transactions, and are indeed forbidden, except in the case of real estate, an exception which is itself a survival of the conditions of an earlier age, to employ them otherwise. German trustees were not released from a similar obligation until 1923, by which date the value of trust funds invested in titles to money had entirely disappeared. As in other respects, so also in this, the 19th century relied on the future permanence of its own happy experiences and disregarded the warning of past misfortunes. It chose to forget that there is no historical warrant for expecting money to be represented even by a constant quantity of a particular metal, far less by a constant purchasing power. Yet money is simply that which the state declares from time to time to be a good legal discharge of money contracts. In 1914, gold had not been the English standard for a century or the sole standard of any other country for half a century. There is no record of a prolonged war or a great social upheaval which has not been accompanied by a change in the legal tender, but an almost unbroken chronicle in every country which has a history, back to the earliest dawn of economic record, of a progressive deterioration in the real value of the successive legal tenders which have represented money. Moreover, this progressive deterioration in the value of money through history is not an accident, and has had behind it two great driving forces: the impecuniosity of governments and the superior political influence of the debtor class. The power of taxation by currency depreciation is one which has been inherent in the state since Rome discovered it. The creation of legal tender has been and is a government's ultimate reserve, and no state or government is likely to decree its own bankruptcy or its own downfall, so long as this instrument still lies at hand unused. 10. Besides this, as we shall see below, the benefits of a depreciating currency are not restricted to the government. Farmers and debtors and all persons liable to pay fixed money dues share in the advantage. As now in the persons of businessmen, so also in former ages these classes constituted the active and constructive elements in the economic scheme. Those secular changes, therefore, which in the past have depreciated money, assisted the new men and emancipated them from the dead hand. They benefited new wealth at the expense of old, and armed enterprise against accumulation. The tendency of money to depreciate has been in past times a weighty counterpoise against the cumulative results of compound interest and the inheritance of fortunes. It has been a loosening influence against the rigid distribution of old-won wealth and the separation of ownership from activity. By this means each generation can disinherit in part its predecessor's heirs, and the project of founding a perpetual fortune must be disappointed in this way, unless the community with conscious deliberation provides against it in some other way, more equitable and more expedient. At any rate, under the influence of these two forces, the financial necessities of governments and the political influence of the debtor class, sometimes the one and sometimes the other, the progress of inflation has been continuous, if we consider long periods, ever since money was first devised in the 6th century B.C. Sometimes the standard of value has depreciated of itself. Failing this, debasements have done the work. Nevertheless, it is easy at all times, as a result of the way we use money in daily life, to forget all this and to look on money as itself the absolute standard of value, and when, besides, the actual events of 100 years have not disturbed his illusions, the average man regards what has been normal for 3 generations as a part of the permanent social fabric. The course of events during the 19th century favored such ideas. During its first quarter, the very high prices of the Napoleonic Wars were followed by a somewhat rapid improvement in the value of money. For the next 70 years, with some temporary fluctuations, the tendency of prices continued to be downwards, the lowest point being reached in 1896. But while this was the tendency as regards direction, the remarkable feature of this long period was the relative stability of the price level. Approximately the same level of price ruled in or about the years 1826, 1841, 1855, 1862, 1867, 1871, and 1915. Prices were also level in the years 1844, 1881, and 1914. If we call the index number of these latter years 100, we find that, for the period of close on a century from 1826 to the outbreak of war, the maximum fluctuation in either direction was 30 points, the index number never rising above 130 and never falling below 70. No wonder that we came to believe in the stability of money contracts over a long period. The metal gold might not possess all the theoretical advantages of an artificially regulated standard, but it could not be tampered with and had proved reliable in practice. At the same time, the investor in consols in the early part of the century had done very well in 3 different ways. The security of his investment had come to be considered as near absolute perfection as was possible. Its capital value had uniformly appreciated, partly for the reason just stated, but chiefly because the steady fall in the rate of interest increased the number of years' purchase of the annual income which represented the capital. And the annual money income had a purchasing power which on the whole was increasing. If, for example, we consider the 70 years from 1826 to 1896, and ignore the great improvement immediately after Waterloo, we find that the capital value of consols rose steadily, with only temporary setbacks, from 79 to 109, in spite of Goshen's conversion from a 3% rate to a 2.75% rate in 1889 and a 2.5% rate effective in 1903. While the purchasing power of the annual dividends, even after allowing for the reduced rates of interest, had increased 50 per 13 cent. But consols, too, had added the virtue of stability to that of improvement. Except in years of crisis, consols never fell below 90 during the reign of Queen Victoria, and even in 48, when thrones were crumbling, the mean price of the year fell but 5 points. 90 when she ascended the throne, they reached their maximum with her in the year of Diamond Jubilee. What wonder that our parents thought consols a good investment? Thus there grew up during the 19th century a large, powerful, and greatly respected class of persons, well-to-do individually and very wealthy in the aggregate, who owned neither buildings, nor land, nor businesses, nor precious metals, but titles to an annual income in legal tender money. In particular, that peculiar creation and pride of the 19th century, the savings of the middle class, had been mainly thus embarked. Custom and favorable experience had acquired for such investments an unimpeachable reputation for security. Before the war, these medium fortunes had already begun to suffer some loss, as compared with the summit of their prosperity in the middle 90s, from the rise in prices and also in the rate of interest. But the monetary events which have accompanied and have followed the war have taken from them about 1/2 of their real value in England, 7/8 in France, 11/12 in Italy, and virtually the whole in Germany and in the succession states of Austria, Hungary, and Russia. The loss to the typical English investor of the pre-war period is sufficiently measured by the loss to the investor in consols. Such an investor, as we have already seen, was steadily improving his position, apart from temporary fluctuations, up to 1896, and in this and the following year two maxima were reached simultaneously, both the capital value of an annuity and also the purchasing power of money. Between 1896 and 1914, on the other hand, the investor had already suffered a serious loss. The capital value of his annuity had fallen by about a third, and the purchasing power of his income had also fallen by nearly a third. This loss, however, was incurred gradually over a period of nearly 20 years from an exceptional maximum, and did not leave him appreciably worse off than he had been in the early 80s or the early 40s. But upon the top of this came the further swifter loss of the war period. Between 1914 and 1920, the capital value of the investor's annuity again fell by more than a third, and the purchasing power of his income by about 2/3. In addition, the standard rate of income tax rose from 7.5% in 1914 to 30% in 1921. Roughly estimated in round numbers, the change may be represented thus in terms of an index of which the base year is 1914. Purchasing power and capital value. In the early 19th century, 1815, both the purchasing power and capital value were relatively low. They increased through the 19th century, peaking around 1896. Impact of tax. The introduction of income tax affects the net income from these bonds, but the trends largely mirror the pre-tax income. World War I period, 1914 to 1922, there was a dramatic decline in all metrics. By 1920, the purchasing power of the income had plummeted to 34 from 100 in 1914, and the capital value of consols had also sharply fallen. Partial recovery. There was a slight rebound in these metrics in 1921 and 1922, but they remain significantly lower than pre-war levels. Early 19th century, 1815 to 1841, initially low purchasing power of both income and capital value of consols saw improvement. By 1841, both metrics had stabilized, with slight fluctuations. Late 19th century, 1869 to 1896, there is a notable increase, especially in the purchasing power of the capital value, which reaches its peak at 208 in 1896. Early 20th century, 1914, a reset occurs, with all values reverting to a baseline of 100, likely influenced by global events such as World War I. Post-war period, 1920–1922, a dramatic decline in all metrics, most likely due to the economic aftermath of World War I and possibly inflation. The purchasing power of the capital value falls to its lowest at 22 in 1920 before slightly recovering. The second column well illustrates what a splendid investment gilt-edged stocks had been through the century from Waterloo to Mons, even if we omit altogether the abnormal values of 1896 to 97. Our table shows how the epoch of Diamond Jubilee was the culminating moment in the prosperity of the British middle class. But it also exhibits with the precision of figures the familiar bewailed plight of those who try to live on the income of the same trustee investments as before the war. The owner of consols in 1922 had a real income, one half of what he had in 1914 and one third of what he had in 1896. The whole of the improvement of the 19th century had been obliterated, and his situation was not quite so good as it had been after Waterloo. Some mitigating circumstances should not be overlooked. Whilst the war was a period of the dissipation of the community's resources as a whole, it was a period of saving for the individuals of the saving class, who with their larger holdings of the securities of the government now have an increased aggregate money claim on the receipts of the exchequer. Also, the investing class, which has lost money, overlaps, both socially and by the ties of family, with the business class, which has made money, sufficiently to break in many cases the full severity of the loss. Moreover, in England, there has been a substantial recovery from the low point of 1920. But these things do not wash away the significance of the facts. The effect of the war, and of the monetary policy which has accompanied and followed it, has been to take away a large part of the real value of the possessions of the investing class. The loss has been so rapid and so intermixed in the time of its occurrence with other worse losses that its full measure is not yet separately apprehended. But it has effected, nevertheless, a far-reaching change in the relative position of different classes. Throughout the continent, the pre-war savings of the middle class, so far as they were invested in bonds, mortgages, or bank deposits, have been largely or entirely wiped out. Nor can it be doubted that this experience must modify social psychology towards the practice of saving and investment. What was deemed most secure has proved least so. He who neither spent nor speculated, who made proper provision for his family, who sang hymns to security and observed most straitly the morals of the edified and the respectable injunctions of the worldly wise, he, indeed, who gave fewest pledges to fortune has yet suffered her heaviest visitations. What moral for our present purpose should we draw from this? Chiefly, I think, that it is not safe or fair to combine the social organization developed during the 19th century, and still retained, with a lesser fair policy towards the value of money. It is not true that our former arrangements have worked well. If we are to continue to draw the voluntary savings of the community into investments, we must make it a prime object of deliberate state policy that the standard of value, in terms of which they are expressed, should be kept stable, adjusting in other ways, calculated to touch all forms of wealth equally and not concentrated on the relatively helpless investors, the redistribution of the national wealth, if, in course of time, The laws of inheritance and the rate of accumulation have drained too great a proportion of the income of the active classes into the spending control of the inactive. The consequences to society of changes in the value of money edited for audiobook presentation. A truth, peace loves public service. 2. The business class. It has long been recognized, by the business world and by economists alike, that a period of rising prices acts as a stimulus to enterprise and is beneficial to businessmen. In the first place, there is the advantage which is the counterpart of the loss to the investing class which we have just examined. When the value of money falls, it is evident that those persons who have engaged to pay fixed sums of money yearly out of the profits of active business must benefit, since their fixed money outgoings will bear a smaller proportion than formerly to their money turnover. This benefit persists not only during the transitional period of change, but also, so far as old loans are concerned, when prices have settled down at their new and higher level. For example, the farmers throughout Europe, who had raised by mortgage the funds to purchase the land they farmed, now find themselves almost freed from the burden at the expense of the mortgagees. But during the period of change, while prices are rising month by month, the businessman has a further and greater source of windfall. Whether he is a merchant or a manufacturer, he will generally buy before he sells, and on at least a part of his stock he will run the risk of price changes. If, therefore, month after month his stock appreciates on his hands, he is always selling at a better price than he 19 expected and securing a windfall profit upon which he had not calculated. In such a period, the business of trade becomes unduly easy. Anyone who can borrow money and is not exceptionally unlucky must make a profit, which he may have done little to deserve. The continuous enjoyment of such profits engenders an expectation of their renewal. The practice of borrowing from banks is extended beyond what is normal. If the market expects prices to rise still further, it is natural that stocks of commodities should be held speculatively for the rise, and for a time the mere expectation of a rise is sufficient, by inducing speculative purchases, to produce one. The statist index for raw materials from April 1919 to March 1920 shows a consistent upward trend, signifying an increase in the cost of raw materials over this period. Starting at a baseline of 100 in April 1919, the index peaks at 150 in February 1920 before slightly retreating to 146 in March 1920. The data suggests that there was significant inflation in the cost of raw materials during this post-World War I period, with an overall increase of 46% over the year. The most considerable monthly jumps are observed between October to November and January to February, while the index slightly decreases only once, from February to March 1920. It follows from this table that a man, who borrowed money from his banker and used the proceeds to purchase raw materials selected at random, stood to make a profit in every single month of this period with the exception of the last, and would have cleared 46% on the average of the year. Yet bankers were not charging at this time above 7% for their advances, leaving a clear profit of between 20, 30 and 40% per annum, without the exercise of any particular skill, to any person lucky enough to have embarked on these courses. How much more were the opportunities of persons whose business position and expert knowledge enable them to exercise intelligent anticipation as to the probable course of prices of particular commodities? Yet any dealer in or user of raw materials on a large scale who knew his trade was thus situated. The profits of certain kinds of business to the man who has a little skill or some luck are certain in such a period to be inordinate. Great fortunes may be made in a few months. But apart from all such, the steady-going businessman, who would be pained and insulted at the thought of being designated speculator or profiteer, may find windfall profits dropping into his lap which he has neither sought nor desired. Economists draw an instructive distinction between what are termed the money rate of interest and the real rate of interest. If the sum of money worth 100 in terms of commodities at the time when the loan is made is lent for a year at 5% interest, and is only worth 90 in terms of commodities at the end of the year, the lender receives back, including his interest, what is only worth 94.5. This is expressed by saying that while the money rate of interest was 5%, the real rate of interest had actually been negative and equal to minus 5.5%. In the same way, if at the end of the period the value of money had risen and the capital sum lent had come to be worth 110 in terms of commodities, while the money rate of interest would still be 5%, the real rate of interest would have been 15.5%. Such considerations, even though they are not explicitly present to the minds of the business world, are far from being academic. The business world may speak, and even think, as though the money rate of interest could be considered by itself, without reference to the real rate. But it does not act so. The merchant or manufacturer, who is calculating whether a 7% bank rate is so onerous as to compel him to curtail his operations, is very much influenced by his anticipations about the prospective price of the commodity in which he is interested. Thus, when prices are rising, the businessman who borrows money is able to repay the lender with what, in terms of real value, not only represents no interest, but is even less than the capital originally advanced. That is, the real rate of interest falls to a negative value, and the borrower reaps a corresponding benefit. It is true that, in so far as a rise of prices is foreseen, attempts to get advantage from this by increased borrowing force the money rates of interest to move upwards. It is for this reason, amongst others, that a high bank rate should be associated with a period of rising prices, and a low bank rate with a period of falling prices. The apparent abnormality of the money rate of interest at such times is merely the other side of the attempt of the real rate of interest to steady itself. Nevertheless, in a period of rapidly changing prices, the money rate of interest seldom adjusts itself adequately or fast enough to prevent the real rate from becoming abnormal. For it is not the fact of a given rise of prices, but the expectation of a rise compounded of the various possible price movements and the estimated probability of each, which affects money rates, and in countries where the currency has not collapsed completely, there has seldom or never existed a sufficient general confidence in a further rise or fall of prices to cause the short money rate of interest to rise above 10% per annum, or to fall below 1%. A fluctuation of this order is not sufficient to balance the movement of prices, up or down, of more than, say, 5% per annum, a rate which the actual price movement has frequently exceeded. Germany has recently provided an illustration of the extraordinary degree in which the money rate of interest can rise in its endeavor to keep up with the real rate, when prices have continued to rise for so long and with such violence that, rightly or wrongly, everyone believes that they will continue to rise further. Yet even there the money rate of interest has never risen high enough to keep pace with the rise of prices. In the autumn of 1922, the full effects were just becoming visible of the long preceding period during which the real rate of interest in Germany had reached a high negative figure, that is to say, during which anyone who could borrow marks and turn them into assets would have found at the end of any given period that the appreciation in the mark value of the assets was far greater than the interest he had to pay for borrowing them. By this means great fortunes were snatched out of general calamity, and those made most who had seen first that the right gain was to borrow and to borrow and to borrow, and thus secure the difference between the real rate of interest and the money rate. But after this had been good business for many months, everyone began to take a hand, with belated results on the money rate of interest. At that time, with a nominal Reichsbank rate of 8%, the effective gilt-edged rate for short loans had risen to 22% per annum. During the first half of 1923, the rate of the Reichsbank itself rose to 24%, and subsequently to 30%, and finally 108%, whilst the market rate fluctuated violently at preposterous figures, reaching at times 3% per week for certain types of loan. With the final currency collapse of July to September 1923, the open market rate was altogether demoralized, and reached figures of 100% per month. In face, however, of the rate of currency depreciation. Even such figures were inadequate, and the bold borrower was still making money. In Hungary, Poland, and Russia, wherever prices were expected to collapse yet further, the same phenomenon was present, exhibiting as through a microscope what takes place everywhere when prices are expected to rise. On the other hand, when prices are falling 30 to 40% between the average of one year and that of the next, as they were in Great Britain and in the United States during 1921, even a bank rate of 1% would have been oppressive to business, since it would have corresponded to a very high rate of real interest. Anyone who could have foreseen the movement even partially would have done well for himself by selling out his assets and staying out of business for the time being. But if the depreciation of money is a source of gain to the businessman, it is also the occasion of opprobrium. To the consumer, the businessman's exceptional profits appear as the cause, instead of the consequence, of the hated rise of prices. Amidst the rapid fluctuations of his fortunes, he himself loses his conservative instincts, and begins to think more of the large gains of the moment than of the lesser, but permanent, profits of normal business. The welfare of his enterprise in the relatively distant future weighs less with him than before, and thoughts are excited of a quick fortune and clearing out. His excessive gains have come to him unsought and without fault or design on his part, but once acquired he does not lightly surrender them, and will struggle to retain his booty. With such impulses and so placed, the businessman is himself not free from a suppressed uneasiness. In his heart, he loses his former self-confidence in his relation to society, in his utility and necessity in the economic scheme. He fears the future of his business and his class, and the less secure he feels his fortune to be, the tighter he clings to it. The businessman, the prop of society and the builder of the future, to whose activities and rewards there had been accorded, not long ago, an almost religious sanction, he of all men and classes most respectable, praiseworthy and necessary, with whom interference was not only disastrous, but almost impious, was now to suffer sidelong glances, to feel himself suspected and attacked, the victim of unjust and injurious laws, to become, and know himself half guilty, a profiteer. No man of spirit will consent to remain poor if he believes his betters to have gained their goods by lucky gambling. To convert the businessman into the profiteer is to strike a blow at capitalism, because it destroys the psychological equilibrium which permits the perpetuance of unequal rewards. The economic doctrine of normal profits, vaguely apprehended by every one, is a necessary condition for the justification of capitalism. The businessman is only tolerable so long as his gains can be held to bear some relation to what, roughly and in some sense, his activities have contributed to society. This, then, is the second disturbance to the existing economic order for which the depreciation of money is responsible. If the fall in the value of money discourages investment, it also discredits enterprise. Not that the businessman was allowed, even during the period of boom, to retain the whole of his exceptional profits. A host of popular remedies vainly attempted to cure the evils of the day, which remedies themselves, subsidies, price and rent fixing, profiteer hunting, and excess profits duties, eventually became not the least part of the evils. In due course came the depression, with falling prices, which operate on those who hold stocks in a manner exactly opposite to rising prices. Excessive losses, bearing no relation to the efficiency of the business, took the place of windfall gains, and the effort of every one to hold as small stocks as possible brought industry to a standstill, just as previously their efforts to accumulate stocks had overstimulated it. Unemployment succeeded profiteering as the problem of the hour, but whilst the cyclical movement of trade and credit has, in the good currency countries, partly reversed, for the time being at least, the great rise of 1920, it has, in the countries of continuing inflation, made no more than a ripple on the rapids of depreciation. 3. The earner. It has been a commonplace of economic textbooks that wages tend to lag behind prices, with the result that the real earnings of the wage earner are diminished during a period of rising prices. This has often been true in the past, and may be true even now of certain classes of labor which are ill-placed or ill-organized for improving their position. But in Great Britain, at any rate, and in the United States also, some important sections of labor were able to take advantage of the situation not only to obtain money wages equivalent in purchasing power to what they had before, but to secure a real improvement, to combine this with a diminution in their hours of work, and, so far, of the work done, and to accomplish this, in the case of Great Britain, at a time when the total wealth of the community as a whole had suffered a decrease. This reversal of the usual course has not been due to an accident and is traceable to definite causes. The organization of certain classes of labor, railwaymen, miners, dockers, and others, for the purpose of securing wage increases is better than it was. Life in the army, perhaps for the first time in the history of wars, raised in many respects the conventional standard of requirements. The soldier was better clothed, better shod, and often better fed than the laborer, and his wife, adding in wartime a separation allowance to new opportunities to earn, had also enlarged her ideas. But these influences, while they would have supplied the motive, might have lacked the means to the result if it had not been for another factor, the windfalls of the profiteer. The fact that the businessman had been gaining, and gaining notoriously, considerable windfall profits in excess of the normal profits of trade, laid him open to pressure, not only from his employees but from public opinion generally, and enabled him to meet this pressure without financial difficulty. In fact, it was worth his while to pay ransom, and to share with his workmen the good fortune of the day. Thus, the working classes improved their relative position in the years following the war, as against all other classes except that of the profiteers. In some important cases, they improved their absolute position, that is to say, account being taken of shorter hours, increased money wages, and higher prices. Some sections of the working classes secured for themselves a higher real remuneration for each unit of effort or work done. But we cannot estimate the stability of this state of affairs, as contrasted with its desirability, unless we know the source from which the increased reward of the working classes was drawn. Was it due to a permanent modification of the economic factors which determine the distribution of the national product between different classes? Or was it due to some temporary and exhaustible influence connected with inflation and with the resulting disturbance in the standard of value? A violent disturbance of the standard of value obscures the true situation, and for a time one class can benefit at the expense of another surreptitiously and without producing immediately the inevitable reaction. In such conditions, the country can without knowing it expend in current consumption those savings which it thinks it is investing for the future, and it can even trench on existing capital or fail to make good its current depreciation. When the value of money is greatly fluctuating, the distinction between capital and income becomes confused. It is one of the evils of a depreciating currency that it enables a community to live on its capital unawares. The increasing money value of the community's capital goods obscures temporarily a diminution in the real quantity of the stock. The period of depression has exacted its penalty from the working classes more in the form of unemployment than by a lowering of real wages, and state assistance to the unemployed has greatly moderated even this penalty. Money wages have followed prices downwards, but the depression of 1921-22 did not reverse or even greatly diminish the relative advantage gained by the working classes over the middle class during the previous years. In 1923, British wage rates stood at an appreciably higher level above the pre-war rates than did the cost of living, if allowance is made for the shorter hours worked. In Germany and Austria also, but in a far greater degree than in England or in France, the change in the value of money has thrown the burden of hard circumstances on the middle class, and hitherto the labouring class have by no means supported their full proportionate share. If it be true that university professors in Germany have some responsibility for the atmosphere which bred war, their class has paid the penalty. The effects of the impoverishment, throughout Europe, of the middle class, out of which most good things have sprung, must slowly accumulate in a decay of science and art. We conclude that inflation redistributes wealth in a manner very injurious to the investor, very beneficial to the businessman, and probably, in modern industrial conditions, beneficial on the whole to the earner. Its most striking consequence is its injustice to those who in good faith have committed their savings to titles, to money rather than to things. But injustice on such a scale has further consequences. The above discussion suggests that the diminution in the production of wealth which has taken place in Europe since the war has been, to a certain extent, at the expense, not of the consumption of any class, but of the accumulation of capital. Moreover, inflation has not only diminished the capacity of the investing class to save, but has destroyed the atmosphere of confidence which is a condition of the willingness to save. Yet a growing population requires, for the maintenance of the same standard of life, a proportionate growth of capital. In Great Britain for many years to come, regardless of what the birth rate may be from now onwards, and at the present time the number of births per day is nearly double the number of deaths, upwards of 250,000 new labourers will enter the labour market annually in excess of those going out of it. To maintain this growing body of labor at the same standard of life as before, we require not merely growing markets but a growing capital equipment. In order to keep our standards from deterioration, the national capital must grow as fast as the national labor supply, which means new savings of at least £250 million per annum at present. The favorable conditions for saving which existed in the 19th century, even though we smile at him, provided a proportionate growth between capital and population. The disturbance of the pre-existing balance between classes, which in its origins is largely traceable to the changes in the value of money, may have destroyed these favorable conditions. The consequences to society of changes in the value of money, edited for audio book presentation, A Truth, Peace Loves Public Service. Chapter 1. Part 2. The stability of money's value and its impact on production in a free market system. The expectations of future price movements can significantly influence production decisions. If businesses anticipate a decline in prices, production may slow down, and if a rise is expected, production may surge. These reactions, though rational from a business perspective, may not always align with societal welfare. The real wealth of society remains unaffected by shifts in the value of money. However, relative price movements should influence production decisions, as they signal imbalances in the supply and demand of various goods. Changes in the overall price level, however, shouldn't ideally affect what and how much is produced. Current economic structures have intricacies that make them sensitive to price level expectations. For instance, any alteration in the general price level affects the wealth distribution between borrowers, who initiate production, and lenders. If borrowers foresee a price change, they can adjust their actions to minimize losses or maximize gains. This means that production intensity is often driven by anticipated profits, which can be problematic when the value standard fluctuates. Modern production methods, characterized by complex supply chains and technical processes, have amplified the risks associated with production. A major component of this risk arises from the instability in money's value. As businesses invest money upfront in production, expecting returns in the future, they inherently speculate on future prices. If businesses expect falling prices, they might reduce their production activities, leading to unemployment. Moreover, widespread expectations can be self-fulfilling. If most believe prices will rise and act on that belief, prices might indeed rise, reinforcing the initial expectation. Conversely, the same holds true for falling prices. Historically, economists have recognized patterns in the value of money, with some factors causing continuous changes and others causing periodic fluctuations. Recent discussions have focused on identifying the root causes of these fluctuations. For a healthy economy, it's crucial to avoid strong expectations of significant price changes in either direction. While completely eliminating factors that could cause initial price movements seems unfeasible, a solution might lie in actively managing the value standard. Monetary authorities should counteract any factors that might induce price level expectations. Even if such interventions aren't perfect, they're better than letting unchecked market forces dictate the value of money, which can lead to production inefficiencies. We see, therefore, that rising prices and falling prices each have the characteristic disadvantage. The inflation which causes the former means injustice to individuals and to classes, particularly to investors, and is therefore unfavorable to saving. The deflation which causes falling prices means impoverishment to labor and to enterprise by leading entrepreneurs to restrict production in their endeavor to avoid loss to themselves, and is therefore disastrous to employment. The counterparts are, of course, also true, namely that deflation means injustice to borrowers, and that inflation leads to the overstimulation of industrial activity. But these results are not so marked as those emphasized above, because borrowers are in a better position to protect themselves from the worst effects of deflation than lenders are to protect themselves from those of inflation, and because labor is in a better position to protect itself from overexertion in good times than from underemployment in bad times. Thus, inflation is unjust and deflation is inexpedient. Of the two, perhaps deflation is, if we rule out exaggerated inflations such as that of Germany, the worse, because it is worse, in an impoverished world, to provoke unemployment than to disappoint the rentier. But it is not necessary that we should weigh one evil against the other. It is easier to agree that both are evils to be shunned. The individualistic capitalism of today, precisely because it entrusts saving to the individual investor and production to the individual employer, presumes a stable measuring rod of value, and cannot be efficient, perhaps cannot survive, without one. For these grave causes we must free ourselves from the deep distrust which exists against allowing the regulation of the standard of value to be the subject of deliberate decision. We can no longer afford to leave it in the category of which the distinguishing characteristics are possessed in different degrees by the weather, the birth rate, and the constitution, matters which are settled by natural causes, or are the resultant of the separate action of many individuals acting independently, or require a revolution to change them. Chapter 2, Public Finance and Changes in the Value of Money. Inflation as a method of taxation. A government can live for a long time, even the German government or the Russian government, by printing paper money. That is to say, it can by this means secure the command over real resources, resources just as real as those obtained by taxation. The method is condemned, but its efficacy, up to a point, must be admitted. A government can live by this means when it can live by no other. It is the form of taxation which the public find hardest to evade, and even the weakest government can enforce, when it can enforce nothing else. Of this character have been the progressive and catastrophic inflations practiced in Central and Eastern Europe, as distinguished from the limited and oscillatory inflations experienced, for example, in Great Britain and the United States, which have been examined in the preceding chapter. The quantity theory of money states that the amount of cash which the community requires, assuming certain habits of business and of banking to be established, and assuming also a given level and distribution of wealth, depends on the level of prices. If the consumption and production of actual goods are unaltered, but prices and wages are doubled, then twice as much cash as before is required to do the business. The truth of this, properly explained and qualified, it is foolish to deny. The theory infers from this that the aggregate real value of all the paper money in circulation remains more or less the same, irrespective of the number of units of it in circulation, provided the habits and prosperity of the people are not changed, i.e., the community retains in the shape of cash the command over a more or less constant amount of real wealth, which is the same thing as to say that the total quantity of money in circulation has a more or less fixed purchasing power. Recent financial trends in Germany, Austria, and Russia serve as examples. Data tables show how these countries' paper currencies' gold values changed over time. Key insights from the tables. During currency collapses, the rate of money's value depreciation surpasses the rate of its volume inflation. For instance, from December 1920 to June 1923, the German mark's volume increased 200-fold, while its value decreased 2,500-fold. The data for Austria and Russia, although starting at different points, display similar patterns. These tables begin after some depreciation has taken place. The initial data points still reflect a period when many hoped for a recovery, unaware of the impending decline. As situations worsened and money was used less, the total value of the note issue dropped by around 80%. Extreme circumstances could cause further decreases, but unless money is entirely abandoned, there's a base level from which recovery can occur sharply. Let us suppose that there are in circulation 9 million currency notes, and that they have altogether a value equivalent to 36 million gold dollars. Suppose that the government prints a further 3 million notes, so that the amount of currency is now 12 million. Then, in accordance with the above theory, the 12 million notes are still only equivalent to $36 million. In the first state of affairs, therefore, each note equals $4, and in the second state of affairs each note equals $3. Consequently, the 9 million notes originally held by the public are now worth $27 million instead of $36 million, and the 3 million notes newly issued by the government are worth $9 million. Thus, by the process of printing the additional notes, the government has transferred from the public to itself an amount of resources equal to $9 million, just as successfully as if it had raised this sum in taxation. On whom has the tax fallen? Clearly on the holders of the original 9 million notes, whose notes are now worth 25% less than they were before. The inflation has amounted to a tax of 25% on all holders of notes in proportion to their holdings. The burden of the tax is well spread, cannot be evaded, costs nothing to collect, and falls, in a rough sort of way, in proportion to the wealth of the victim. No wonder its superficial advantages have attracted ministers of finance. Temporarily, the yield of the tax is even a little better for the government than by the above calculation. For the new notes can be passed off at first at the same value as though there were still only 9 million notes altogether. It is only after the new notes get into circulation and people begin to spend them that they realize that the notes are worth less than before. What is there to prevent the government from repeating this process over and over again? The reader must observe that the aggregate note issue is still worth $36 million. If, therefore, the government now prints a further 4 million notes, there will be 16 million notes altogether, which by the same argument as before are worth $2.25 each instead of $3, and by issuing the 4 million notes the government has, just as before, transferred an amount of resources equal to $9 million from the public to itself. The holders of notes have again suffered a tax of 25% in proportion to their holdings. Like other forms of taxation, these exactions, if overdone and out of proportion to the wealth of the community, must diminish its prosperity and lower its standards, so that at the lower standard of life the aggregate value of the currency may fall and still be enough to go round. But this effect cannot interfere very much with the efficacy of taxing by inflation. Even if the aggregate real value of the currency falls for these reasons to a half or two-thirds of what it was before, which represents a tremendous lowering of the standards of life, this only means that the quantity of notes which the government must issue in order to obtain a given result must be raised proportionately. It remains true that by this means the government can still secure for itself a large share of the available surplus of the community. Has the public in the last resort no remedy, no means of protecting itself against these ingenious depredations? It has only one remedy, to change its habits in the use of money. The initial assumption on which our argument rested was that the community did not change its habits in the use of money. Experience shows that the public generally is very slow to grasp the situation and embrace the remedy. Indeed, At first, there may be a change of habit in the wrong direction, which actually facilitates the government's operations. The public is so much accustomed to thinking of money as the ultimate standard that, when prices begin to rise, believing that the rise must be temporary, they tend to hoard their money and to postpone purchases, with the result that they hold in monetary form a larger aggregate of real value than before. And, similarly, when the fall in the real value of the money is reflected in the exchanges, foreigners, thinking that the fall is abnormal and temporary, purchase the money for the purpose of hoarding it. But sooner or later the second phase sets in. The public discover that it is the holders of notes who suffer taxation and defray the expenses of government, and they begin to change their habits and to economize in their holding of notes. They can do this in various ways. 1. Instead of keeping some part of their ultimate reserves in money, they can spend this money on durable objects, jewelry or household goods, and keep their reserves in this form instead. 2. They can reduce the amount of till money and pocket money that they keep and the average length of time for which they keep it. 11. Even at the cost of great personal inconvenience. And 3. They can employ foreign money in many transactions where it would have been more natural and convenient to use their own. By these means they can get along and do their business with an amount of notes having an aggregate real value substantially less than before. For example, the notes in circulation become worth altogether $20 million instead of $36 million, with the result that the next inflationary levy by the government, falling on a smaller amount, must be at a greater rate in order to yield a given sum. When the public take alarm faster than they can change their habits, and, in their efforts to avoid loss, run down the amount of real resources, which they hold in the form of money, below the working minimum, seeking to supply their daily needs for cash by borrowing, they get penalized, as in Germany in 1923, by prodigious rates of money interest. The rates rise, as we have seen in the previous chapter, until the rate of interest on money equals or exceeds the anticipated rate of the depreciation of money. Indeed, it is always likely, when money is rapidly depreciating, that there will be recurrent periods of scarcity of currency, because the public, in their anxiety not to hold too much money, will fail to provide themselves even with the minimum which they will require in practice. Whilst economists have sometimes described these phenomena in terms of an increase in the velocity of circulation due to loss of confidence in the currency, nevertheless, there are not, I think, many passages in economic literature where the matter is clearly analyzed. Professor Cannon's article on the application of the apparatus of supply and demand to units of currency, Economic Journal, December 1921, is one of the most noteworthy. He points out that the common assumption that the elasticity of demand for money is unity is equivalent to the assertion that a mere variation in the quantity of money does not affect the willingness and habits of the public as holders of purchasing power in that form. But in extreme cases, this assumption does not hold, for if it did, there would be no limit to the sums which the government could extract from the public by means of inflation. It is, therefore, unsafe to assume that the elasticity of demand is necessarily unity. Professor Leyfelt followed this up in a subsequent issue of the Economic Journal, December 1922, by a calculation of the actual elasticity of demand for money in some recent instances. He found that between July 1920 and April 1922, the elasticity of demand for money fell to an average of about 73 in Austria, 67 in Poland, and 5 in Germany. Thus, in the last stages of inflation, the prodigious increase in the velocity of circulation may have as much, or more, effect in raising prices and depreciating the exchanges than the increase in the volume of notes. The note-issuing authorities often cry out against what they regard as the unfair and anomalous fact of the notes falling in value more than in proportion to their increased volume. Yet it is nothing of the kind. It is merely the result of the one method to evade a crushing burden left open to the public, who discover for themselves, sooner than the financiers, that the law of unit elasticity in their demand for money can be escaped. Nevertheless, It is evident that so long as the public use money at all, the government can continue to raise resources by inflation. Moreover, the conveniences of using money in daily life are so great that the public are prepared, rather than forego them, to pay the inflationary tax, provided it is not raised to a prohibitive level. Like other conveniences of life, the use of money is taxable, and although for various reasons this particular form of taxation is highly inexpedient, a government can get resources by a continuous practice of inflation, even when this is foreseen by the public generally, unless the sums they seek to raise in this way are very grossly excessive. Just as a toll can be levied on the use of roads or a turnover tax on business transactions, so also on the use of money. The higher the toll and the tax, the less traffic on the roads, and the less business transacted, so also the less money carried. But some traffic is so indispensable, some business so profitable, some money payments so convenient, that only a very high levy will stop completely all traffic, all business, all payments. A government has to remember, however, that even if a tax is not prohibitive, it may be unprofitable, and that a medium, rather than an extreme, imposition will yield the greatest gain. Suppose that the rate of inflation is such that the value of the money falls by half every year, and suppose that the cash used by the public for retail purchases in shops is turned over 100 times a year, i.e., stays in one pocket for half a week on the average, then this is only equivalent to a turnover tax of 0.5% on each transaction. The public will gladly pay such a tax rather than suffer the trouble and inconvenience of barter with trams and tradesmen. Even if the value of the money falls by half every month, the public, by keeping their pocket money so low that they turn it over once a day on the average instead of only twice a week, can still keep the tax down to the equivalent of less than 2% on each transaction. Even such a terrific rate of depreciation as this is not sufficient, therefore, to counterbalance the advantages of using money rather than barter in the trifling business of daily life. This is the explanation why, even in Germany and in Russia, the government's notes remained current for many retail transactions. For certain other purposes, however, to which money is put in a modern community, the inflationary tax becomes prohibitive at a much earlier stage. As a store of value, for example, money is rapidly discarded as soon as further depreciation is confidently anticipated. As a unit of account, for contracts and for balance sheets, it quickly becomes worse than useless, although for such purposes the privilege of the current money as legal tender for the discharge of debts stands in the way of its being discarded as soon as it ought to be. In the last phase, when the use of the legal tender money has been discarded for all purposes except trifling out-of-pocket expenditure, inflationary taxation has at last defeated itself. For in that case the total value of the note issue, which is sufficient to meet the public's minimum requirements, amounts to a figure relatively so trifling that the amount of resources which the government can hope to raise by yet further inflation, without pushing it to a point at which the money will be discarded even for out-of-pocket trifles, is correspondingly small. Thus, at last, unless it is employed with some measure of moderation, this potent instrument of governmental exaction breaks in the hands of those that use it, and leaves them at the same time with the rest of their fiscal system in total ruins, out of which, in the ebb and flow of the economic life of nations, may emerge once more a reformed and admirable system. The Chervonets of Moscow and the Krone of Vienna are already stabler units than the franc or the lira. The characteristics of each phase emerge clearly. The tables show, first of all, how quickly, during the period of collapse, the rate of the depreciation of the 53 value of the money outstrips the rate of the inflation of its volume. During the collapse of the German mark beginning with December 1920, the rate of depreciation proceeded for some time roughly twice as fast as that of the inflation, and eventually by June 1923, when the volume of the note issue had increased 200-fold compared with December 1920, the value of a paper mark had fallen 2,500-fold. The figures given above for Austria begin at a rather later stage of the debacle. But if we equate Austria in June 1920 to Germany in December 1920, the progress of events between that date and September 1922 is roughly comparable to that in Germany between December 1920 and May 1923. The figures for Russia between January 1919 and the early part of 1923 also exhibit the same general features. These tables all commence after a considerable depreciation had already occurred and the gold value of the aggregate note issue had fallen considerably below the normal. Nevertheless, their earliest entries still belong to the period when an eventual recovery was still widely anticipated and the general public had not at all appreciated what they were in for. They indicate that as the situation develops from this point onwards and the use of money is discarded except for retail transactions, the aggregate value of the note issue falls by about 4/5. As the result of extreme panic or depression, a further fall may occur for a time, but unless the money is discarded altogether, a minimum is reached eventually from which the least favorable circumstance will cause a sharp recovery. The Soviet government have always regarded monetary inflation quite frankly as an instrument of taxation, and have themselves calculated that the purchasing power secured to the state. The temporary recovery in Germany after the collapse of February 1923 exhibited how a point may come when, if the money is to continue in use at all, a bottom is reached and a technical position is created in which some recovery is possible. When the gold value of the currency has fallen to a very low figure, it is easy for the government, if it has any external resources at all, to give sufficient support to prevent the exchange from falling further for the time being. And since by that time the public will have carried their attempts to economize the use of money to a pitch of inconvenience which it is impracticable to continue, even a moderate weakening in the degree of the distrust of the future value of the money will lead to some increase in their use of it, with the result that the aggregate value of the note issue will tend to recover. By February 1923, these conditions existed in Germany in a high degree. The German government was able within 2 months, in the face of most adverse political conditions, to double the exchange value of the mark whilst simultaneously more than doubling the note circulation. Even so, the gold value of the note issue was only brought back to what it had been 6 months earlier, and if even a moderate degree of confidence had been restored, it might have been possible to bring the value of the note circulation of Germany up to, say, 2 million gold marks, £100 million, at least, which is probably about the lowest figure at which it can stand permanently, unless everyone is to put himself to intolerable inconvenience in his efforts to hold as little money as possible. Incidentally, the government is able during the period of recovery to obtain, once more, through the issue of notes, the command over a considerable amount of real resources. Germany. After the February 1923 collapse, Germany demonstrated how a monetary low point can lead to possible recovery. With the gold value of the currency plummeting, the government could temporarily stabilize the exchange. By February 1923, the German government managed to double the mark's exchange value while more than doubling the note circulation. The value could have been increased further if confidence was restored. Austria. After stabilizing its exchange rate, Austria observed a growth in confidence, leading to the gold value of the note issue increasing to almost 2.5 times the low point of September 1922. With foreign assistance and increased confidence, the note issue volume increased without endangering stabilization. Russia. By mid-1922, Russia had reached a point where the use of paper rubles was almost obsolete. However, Soviet financiers believed that with legal compulsion, a certain minimum value could be maintained for these rubles. During April 1922 to April 1923, the aggregate value of the note issue doubled from its lowest point. Moreover, in December 1922, a new currency unit, the chervonets, was introduced alongside the paper ruble. By August 1923, the combined value of Russian note issues had risen substantially, indicating returning confidence. General observation. Inflation rates of 100% every 3 months can be maintained without completely disrupting retail transactions. Anything beyond this rate risks a total monetary collapse. Soviet government's inflation view. The Soviet government saw monetary inflation as a taxation tool. From 1918 to early 1922, they secured purchasing power amounting to approximately £130 million through this method. The Chervonets remained relatively stable in its exchange rate, occasionally selling at a slight premium. The fall of Dr. Kuno's government in August 1923 in Germany was a result of an inflation rate that became destructive for daily transactions. As of mid-1922, the German government had acquired between £75 million and £100 million annually by printing money. While much of this was due to foreign speculation, the German public paid over £50 million yearly through this method. The German note issue's value was £240 million in December 1920 and had not fallen below £100 million by MID 1922. However, by the latter half of 1922, it had declined to about £60 million. A temporary recovery was seen in March 1923, but by mid-1923, the value dropped to approximately £20 million. The German government continued to acquire around £1 million per week by printing notes, leading to a depreciation rate of approximately 5 to 10% weekly. The rule resistance expenses and a breakdown in other tax sources made the government raise between £2 million and £3 million weekly by printing notes. This inflated taxation reached a detrimental point, leading to Dr. Kuno's downfall. Dr. Kuno's government's actions included doubling the note issue in 1 week, taking £3 million from a note issue worth about £4 million, an act surpassing even Soviet excesses. The first step to rectifying the situation is the restoration of a reliable unit of account. The German government is stuck in a vicious cycle, relying on printing unsound money due to a lack of other revenue. Introducing a steady unit of account, while still using the unsound money as a revenue source, is essential for the restoration of standard revenue sources. The recent history of German finance can be summarized thus. Reliance on inflationary taxation, whilst extremely productive to the exchequer in its earliest stages, especially whilst the foreign speculator was still buying paper marks, gradually broke down the mark as a serviceable unit of account, one of the effects of which was to render unproductive the greater part of the rest of the revenue-collecting machinery, most taxes being necessarily assessed at some interval of time before they are collected. The failure of the rest of the revenue rendered the Treasury more and more dependent on inflation, until finally the use of legal tender money had been so far abandoned by the public that even the inflationary tax ceased to be productive and the government was threatened by literal bankruptcy. At this stage, the fiscal organization of the country had been so thoroughly destroyed and its social and economic organization so grievously disordered, as in Russia 18 months earlier, that it was a perplexing problem to devise ways and means by which the government could live during the transitional period whilst the normal machinery for collecting revenue was being recreated, especially in face of the struggle with France proceeding at the same time. Nevertheless, the problem is not insoluble. Many suggestions could be made, and a way out will doubtless be found at length. It is common to speak as though, when a government pays its way by inflation, the people of the country avoid taxation. We have seen that this is not so. What is raised by printing notes is just as much taken from the public as is a beer duty or an income tax. What a government spends the public pay for. There is no such thing as an uncovered deficit. But in some countries it seems possible to please and content the public, for a time at least, by giving them, in return for the taxes they pay, finely engraved acknowledgments on water-marked paper. The income tax receipts, which we in England receive from the surveyor, we throw into the waste paper basket. In Germany they call them banknotes and put them into their pocketbooks. In France they are termed rentes and are locked up in the family safe.
Until our narratives intertwine once more, I remain Tim, wishing you insightful journeys. Brace for tomorrow, for with it comes another chapter in the annals of Trees Live Peace and the Reactionaries. Farewell until we reconvene.